Okay, so I think we're ready to get started. Let me start by introducing the three authors, and I want to thank them again for coming here today. So Gloria Goldreich is the prolific author of Leah's Journey, which won the National Jewish Book Award for Fiction, and the sequel, Leah's Children. Her novel, 4 Days, received the Jewish Federation Arts and Letters Award, and West to Eden was the featured selection of the Troll Book Club. Her work has been widely anthologized and appeared in Commentary, Moment, McCall's, Red Book, Mademoiselle, Ladies' Home Journal, and other publications. She's the mother of 3 adult children and the grandmother of 8 widely scattered grandchildren, and she and her husband reside in Westchester County, New York. Also joining us is Tom Lin. Tom Lin was born in China and immigrated to the United States at the age of 4. A graduate of Pomona College. As of 2021, my understanding is he's pursuing a doctorate in English at the University of California, Davis. His debut novel is the critically acclaimed The Thousand Crimes of Ming. Just last week, it was announced that the book is a 2022 selection for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. So that's some debut. And also with us, we have JenniferRyan. So JenniferRyan is the author of national bestseller, The Chilbury Ladies Choir, The Spies of Shilling Lane, and The Kitchen Front. And while this is anecdotal, I can say I have seen these books pass across the checkout desk a lot. So these are very popular, I guess, with our residents. Her writing has been featured in Literary Hub, Moms Don't Have Time to Write, the Daily Mail, the Irish Times, the Express, BBC Online, New Magazine, the Simple Things Magazine, and others. Previously a book editor with The Economist and the BBC, she now lives in Northern Virginia with her husband and 2 children. So to get started, Gloria Goldreich is kind enough to speak to us for 10 to 15 minutes or so. So thank you, Gloria.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for being with us today for this Literary Saturday. Writers are always asked the same 2 questions during book and author meetings. The one is, where do you get your ideas from? And the second is, how long did it take you to write your book? The second question, particularly by readers who are very time obsessed, as all of us are. The answer to these 2 questions, in my case, and in particularly for my most recent book, The Paris Children, are curiously interlinked. If I were to give an accurate answer, I would say that approximately 2 years pass before I meet with my editor, discuss the idea for the book, and then deliver a completed manuscript. But actually, the writing of the book will have begun many, many years earlier, because books are a long time, novels and ideas are a long time in the dreaming. And historical fiction in particular requires not only the dreaming, but also many, many years and hours of research in libraries, at home, collecting an amalgam of information, some of which will be used, some of which won't. For The Paris Children, this was a more or less putting together the pieces of what I would call a literary jigsaw puzzle. It began when I was a child myself. My parents and my grandparents were Jewish immigrants from Poland. When the Nazi assault on Poland began, the places being described in the newspapers were the meadowlands and glens of their own childhoods. The people being threatened terribly were their own friends and family left behind. And as a child myself, I recall hearing my grandmother, who lived with us in the typical 3-generation immigrant household, saying, the Kinder, what will happen to the Kinder? The Kinder were the children. Her tearful query stayed with me. Later, as a student of history, which was my major, both of my undergraduate and graduate work, I learned what had happened to the Kinder, the children. In the dedication to the Paris Children, I dedicate the book to the 1.5 million Jewish children who were killed during the Nazi Holocaust, the war of genocide, that took place in Europe, not only against Jews, but against a wide swath of an innocent population. The number stayed with me. I went on to complete my undergraduate work and to begin teaching Holocaust studies in high schools. The questions that I got mostly from my students were, but why wasn't there any resistance? Why didn't anyone stop the murders? It was a valid question. I only found the answer many years later when I began to study my graduate work at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I learned about the resistance. It was limited for many different reasons, mostly logistical, but it was there. And during that period, I went to France and to pursue my studies, and I went to the Montparnasse Cemetery, where I thought to look at see the grave of Alfred Dreyfus, who many, many years before World War II had been accused of betraying, falsely accused of betraying the government of France, selling secrets to an enemy, vilified, all on the basis of his being Jewish. Later, he was exonerated and came back to Paris, and he is buried in the Montparnasse Cemetery. Visiting his grave, I saw that there was an attendant tombstone next to it, marked Madeleine Levy, granddaughter of Alfred Dreyfus. And I was curious, and I began to read about the life of Madeleine Levy. And at that point, the pieces of this literary jigsaw puzzle came together. I learned that Madeleine Levy was Alfred Dreyfus's granddaughter. She had been, she was very young when the Nazi onslaught began. She was a social worker, and she had long been a member of a Jewish scout organization called the Éclaireur. And that organization had pledged itself to save as many Jewish children as they could. So I began to think about Madeleine Levy's life, and I call the book that I wrote, instead I had called previous works of historic fiction that I have written, I call it a work of biofiction. What this means is I was working with a real character, a historical character who had lived, that I was pledged as the historian I had trained to be, to use the events of her life in an accurate chronological order. But I was also appropriating the novelist's prerogative of creating relationships and incidents within the parameters of her actual life that were purely of my own imaginings. So I had Madeleine, who I knew through my research had had a very deep friendship and long relationship and a quasi love affair with a man like Claude Lanzmann, also a young member of the Scouts. And I followed their adventures, both actual and imagined. Madeleine Levy and Claude Lanzmann were dedicated to escorting groups of Jewish children under disguise through the Pyrenees, either to Spain or to refuge in Switzerland. They were both very young, and it was a very hazardous journey. In this effort, they were joined by other dedicated individuals, most of them young. Again, I stuck to the historic truth, but created situations that were born of something that I created out of my own feelings and perceptions. So I wrote about Madeline's sister, Simone Pearl, her brother-in-law. I wrote about a young Argentinian Jew named Alex Kaminsky, who became a master forger of documents that were necessary. I included her various efforts, some of which I created myself, some of which I found in archival documents. So Madeline was dedicated to the children. That was her primary objective, rescuing children. This was too abstract for me as a fiction writer. So I wanted to focus on one particular child, and I had her meet a child, again, purely my own invention. And throughout the book, Madeline's adventures in trying to save this particular child, Anna, provide the focus of the novel, which novels need. They need a point of reader identification. She found hiding places for the children. This was no easy task because anyone who hid a Jewish child in Nazi-occupied France, and here again, we have a historic fact that is puzzling and disturbing. The government of France was controlled in Vichy by Nazi collaborators headed by Marshal Pétain. And I had to write about what was actually happening in France, a divided country between resistance fighters and Nazi collaborators. So the hiding places were found. The resistance with people like Madeline and Claude worked steadily. They rescued English pilots who were downed in blitz raids over France. Madeline was deeply involved in such a rescue. They became saboteurs. They bombed bridges so that Nazi troops couldn't go past. Madeline was also involved in these actions, which I created and recreated in the book, but always the focus was on her determination to rescue small Anna Halfberg and another group. Throughout it all, her grandmother, the widow of Alfred Dreyfus, offered her support and sustenance, and repeated throughout the book as Madeline lost hope, gained hope, acted heroically, feared, all the massive emotions that are part of human survivor. And what she said, her grandmother, over and over again, this life is worth its grief. Eventually, Madeline and Claude were betrayed. They found themselves arrested and sent to Drancy, but all they could think about at that point was what had happened to the group of children they were charged with rescuing, and how had they survived. While they were interned at a camp in Drancy, they received a letter. The letter said that all her family were in places of service, and they learned, and I'll quote here from the book, the small group of children, her children, all had successfully made the trek across the Pyrenees and were in Algiers, an encampment, and soon to sail for Palestine. Anna Hofberg, her precious Anna, was safe. A stone was lifted from her heart. Her grandmother's words came to mind, weighted with truth and power. This life is worth its grief. And indeed, for Madeline Levy and for all of us, this life was worth its grief. It is not a happy book. um, dedicated to 1.5 million murdered children and Madeline Levy's sad fate. I have to again read from the epilogue to the book. On November 20th, 1943, 2 days before Madeline Levy's 25th birthday, she and Claude Lanzmann joined convoy number 62, the 15th to leave Drancy. They were among 1,200 Jewish prisoners. The train arrived at Auschwitz on November 23rd, and in January 1944, Madeline Levy, weighing less than 70 pounds, died of typhus at Auschwitz-Birkenau. So the story ends sadly, but for Madeline, indeed, we say her life was surely worth its grief, and to read her story is to pay tribute to her heroism, to the heroism of Claude, and most important, to the heroism of those small children who made the trek to freedom and whose lives were saved. Reading historical fiction is a lesson for all of us. It is a way in which we bring history to life, into our hearts, into our minds, and into our memories. So for all of you readers who are here today, I would encourage you to read not only my book, but any book that continues to teach, to instruct, and to help us to remember. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. I'm going to pass along to our next author, and that is Tom Lin.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Harrison County Public Library, and thank you, Gloria, as well for going first with that marvelous marvelous presentation. It's tough to follow for sure. So I wrote The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su. It is a traditionally structured Western with some supernatural elements. And, you know, speaking in terms of historical fiction, I think one of the things that was so important to me was doing the research and getting the experience right. I think one of the things that we forget about history is that it's a constructed way of narrativizing our past. That history is nothing more than the stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of how we got here. And I think the thing that really struck me is the way in which history has to be carried forward from person to person. And kind of transmitted. And so one of the things that I wanted to think about as I was writing this was that question of the transmittance of memory and how it is that we come to remember anything. So this book is set in 1869 as the Transcontinental Railroad. The very first one is nearing its completion. There are two companies competing, although the quick history lesson here. The Central Pacific is building east from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific is building west from Omaha. They are paid by Uncle Sam per mile completed. They've negotiated those rates in advance. And so their goal is to make as much money as they can before they have to close up the whole thing. And in fact, in their greed and their hurry, they actually almost laid rails directly past one another to overlap, just in case, you know, they decided to go with one and not the other. But they ultimately did meet in Promontory, Utah. And the Transcontinental Railroad is widely regarded as being the reason why America is a bi-coastal sovereign empire. Through the power of the railroads, we, you know, segmented this country into time zones. We dominated all of these indigenous peoples who were living in the interior of the country and drove them out. And so it's a story of not only of violence, but also of labor and exploitation. And I think one thing that really struck me was that theme of labor. As part of the research for this book, I went to many of the places that were covered, and one of them being the Sierra Nevada mountains, which form the border between the northern part of Nevada and California. And I went to this one particular peak called Donner Summit, which you may recognize from the Donner Party that made it out there and resorted to cannibalism. But it's also the site of a series of tunnels dug through Sierra Nevada granite, some of the hardest, densest rock that we have, on the planet. And these tunnels were dug by hand by thousands of Chinese laborers whose names and stories they haven't been lost to history. In fact, they've simply never been written down. They were not deemed important enough to archive. And part of what so fascinated me about that was that the archive is this kind of construction. It represents a continuous series of choices about what to include and what to exclude. And so these stories were excluded from the narrative. But what's amazing to me is that you can't ever exclude what they did. These laborers transformed this country. They laid a grade of rock and gravel that remains to this day. Trucks that, so when cargo lands, if the supply chain works, when cargo lands in San Francisco Bay, right, that gets loaded onto trucks and trains. The trains will take a rail that is quite close to the original Transcontinental Railroad route. And the trucks, if they take Interstate 80, will pass within a dozen miles of the old railroad tracks for almost 100, 200 miles along that length. It has fundamentally structured our present, this past. And even if we deny them their individual stories, we can't help but engage in their labor and what they produced. And so when I was up there in Donner Summit, we hadn't brought snowshoes. I actually realized, I discovered that we should have done that when we took the first step and I sunk in up to my hip. But you go into these tunnels, at this point they're caves, and they're pitch black. And we had headlights, but I'm kind of feeling my way along the rock wall because there's water dripping into the cave, and because it's so cold, it's kind of solidified into this perfectly smooth, horribly slippery mass of black ice that runs into the darkness. And so I'm feeling the rock wall and trying not to slip, because of course I also didn't bring any kind of crampons or traction devices. And as I'm feeling along the wall, I realized that there are these long grooves, which are not natural in origin. And I remember realizing what I was feeling, which was the boreholes that had been drilled by hand by these Chinese laborers 150 odd years ago, blasted with rock, and the remnants of their labor still inscribed on these walls that I was now using to kind of make sure they didn't fall. And so my family immigrated from Beijing, and we speak Mandarin. The Chinese immigrants who came in the 1860s would have spoken Cantonese. And we really would have, if I were to go back in time, or if they were to come forward and we were to speak, we wouldn't really be able to understand each other. We wouldn't have much in common besides one single thing, which is that we were both Chinese in America. And so it was a moving moment to kind of be standing there in this record of labor and to feel that connection through that abyss of time. I want to read a little excerpt from the book. This is my reading copy. It was the one that was most beat up in the box of copies that I received. So I figured might as well take it for myself. But so I'll give you an introduction for this one. The main character, Ming and his companion, the clairvoyant prophet, are sitting around a fire with a magic show full of supernatural performers that they've kind of linked up with. And the prophet has the ability to foretell the day of everyone's death, but he has no memory. He can't remember anything about his own past. Night fell upon them suddenly. They ringed the fire in a tight circle, their backs hunched against the desert chill. Hazel and the boy had gone to their tents. The prophet was humming to himself. "What's that tune, old man?" Proteus asked gruffly. The prophet stopped and smiled. He fixed his clouded eyes on the ringmaster's double. "An old elegy," he said, and he resumed humming. "The hell's an elegy?" Gomez cut in. "A song for the dead," the ringmaster replied. He plucked a burning twig from the fire and lit his pipe. "Any words in them songs?" Gomez asked. The prophet shook his head. "In time, all songs lose their words, and in time beyond time, most lose even their music. Songs without language or melody become as dreams, persisting in the mind without reason or substance. There is only the memory of the song once having been." "Well, who's it for?" Gomez asked. "Every dead," the prophet answered. The ringmaster pulled deeply from his pipe and regarded the prophet with a kind of reverence. "Your companion, Mr. Su, here tells me you have no memory," he said. "Yes," the prophet answered. "Well, what good is an elegy sung by a man who cannot remember?" "Can you remember?" the prophet asked. Of course, the ringmaster said. It is not so, the prophet said after a moment. No man truly remembers the past, and those who claim to are mistaken. Remembrance is the burden of the body and not of the mind. True memory is not to be recollected. It is a right to be performed. He turned to Nota. You who change men's memories, he said, are there not memories impossible to erase? Aye, Nota said, place and routine. Those are true memories, the prophet said. The past enacted continuously in the present as ritual and habit. True memories sound on registers below what the mind can touch, because men can misremember, men can lie, but the body cannot forget. The body has no means of forgetting. He extended a withered arm and pulled back his sleeve to reveal a spiderweb of thin white scars encircling his wrist. Flesh rubbed raw from irons, he murmured. My body remembers a time when it was in chains, even while I cannot. The ringmaster seemed to take this in. He stretched out his hands and warmed them, moving them this way and that in the low light from the dwindling fire. There were scars there too over his knuckles, pale lines across the grain of the skin of his palms. From where Ming sat, the scars seemed to shine. You asked me, the prophet said, what good an elegy is when sung by a man who cannot remember. But know this, all men cannot remember. An elegy is good merely because it is sung. And when its words are lost, it is still good because it is sung. And when even its melody too has been washed away, it is still good because it was once sung. He rose to his feet and cast blind eyes over the men sitting round the fire. To sing at all is to labor, and it is only by labor that men living recall the shadows of men past. This is what it means to remember. At this, the prophet turned and was swallowed up by the darkness.
Thank you, Tom. And our last author for this session is JenniferRyan, so I'll pass it over to her.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Harrison Library for holding this event, and also to Gloria and Tom for giving such lovely performances as well. Yes, so I'll begin first of all by saying a few words about historical fiction. And I think it's just so special to be able to bring the past to life. I think Gloria really touched on this, and Tom as well. It's just the ability to bring a character to life who was actually there at the time and transmit the story of the narrative of somebody's life and how they were changed, or how the circumstances within which they lived were just so meaningful to where we are today. All of my books really talk about women and their role during the Second World War and how suddenly they were needed in Britain in the Second World War. And my books tend to be more light-hearted. They're about the home front, although it touches on very dark themes, of course, as well, which is inevitable, I think, in the Second World War. But, you know, they're one of, I suppose, optimism, of friendship, of women coming together and basically becoming more empowered by the Second World War. When suddenly the men are away and they are needed, and they're given a lot more freedom, and they're given a lot more outlet for their skills and their resourcefulness and, you know, intelligence as well. And I think this is a very important subject to really grasp for just kind of moving on, because we still don't have equality today within sexes. And I think that the lessons of yesteryear are important to kind of understand where we are today and how we can move on with that. So I've made a little slide presentation, and it's got some nice photographs, so I'm going to share it with you just for something a little bit different. So here we are, this is it. So first of all, I want a quick rundown of what the book's about. And it's called The Kitchen Front. It's set in the Second World War in a village in Britain. They're being bombed. there's a massive bombing campaign. A lot of the young men have been taken off to war. And this is causing an awful lot of problems for a lot of the women, and obviously in an awful lot of grief. The cooking food has been rationed a lot, and so an awful lot of ingredients are no longer available, or they're just available in very small amounts. And a lot of cooks have been told to, and housewives are told to make do with small amounts of rations in all the different very basic food ingredients. And in order to do this, they had a radio show called Kitchen Front, and there was an awful lot of propaganda from the government to try to get people on board with the rationing. And so my book is basically a cooking contest. And during the Second World War, they loved contests in Britain to kind of cheer up the country, because there was an awful lot of sadness and grief and difficulty, especially with the bombs as well. And anything that could perk people up was definitely used, particularly something like a contest. Local contests were very popular because it was quite often it was free of charge for locals to come and see, and it was cheap entertainment basically, and something that everyone could get behind and get on board with. So I decided to make a cooking contest to showcase some of the many ways that that women, particularly during the Second World War, dealt with the food rations, and how they managed to get around some of the issues of cooking decent food, basically. But essentially, it's the stories of 4 women who are all they're the competitors in the contest, and they're all going through very, very different experiences in their lives. And it's all about how the war has touched each of them individually, and how they've also become more empowered by the war as well. So let me go on to the next screen here. Yeah, so you can see here's a woman here. Of course I can. Suddenly women were being called on by the government. This is a government propaganda poster. I'm patriotic as can be, and the ration points won't worry me. Basically, women were called on to be resourceful more than anything else. They're resourceful, they're clever. Suddenly there was this real, stop being the pretty housewife. You'll get up and do what you can for the war effort. And here in this lovely photograph, you've got a town hall full of women watching, and this is both a cooking demonstration. And so one of my characters is something called a home economist, who was basically a upper class woman who was taught enough about cooking that they could stand up in front of these women, these ladies, and describe and show them how to make a wartime recipe, such as Lord Bolton pie. So another thing about the book is that I've put a lot of recipes in it from the Second World War. A lot of these come from my grandmother's own recipe book. So the book was very much inspired by my grandmother. Here's a picture of her, Eileen Beckley, in 1938, just before the war began. She was a young woman in the war, and she really had suddenly a lot of freedom. And she said it was just an incredible time because there were a lot of parties and dances and everything. And then, of course, the Americans came over as well. So that was even more exciting. But she had a recipe book that her mother had passed down to her. So you've got these wonderful 2 types of handwriting throughout the book, but you can definitely see the point at which the Second World War rolls in, because suddenly the recipes become very, very different. Meat is not really available. There's an awful lot of offal recipes, but even by 1942, offal became very scarce. And then you started getting a lot more rabbit because people were rearing rabbits in their back gardens. and a lot more vegetarian dishes like Lord Woolton pie. But also you have things like whale meat pie, which is also in the book. I have a recipe for whale meat pie, which was incredibly unpopular at the time. And sheep's head roll is another recipe that's in the book. And there's all sorts of different recipes, and how, just to demonstrate how the different cooks, different ways that cooks dealt with some of these issues. So ration books, there was everyone had a ration book, and it was snipped out. So your the ration that you were using was snipped out every week. This is basically what was rationed. So vegetables weren't rationed, and bread wasn't rationed either. But fats, particularly, and dairy products were very much rationed. So the amount of butter and cheese, you only got 1 egg per week per person. A small amount of sugar, not very much milk either. Children got extra milk, and and so did pregnant women. Meat was very much rationed. There was a little bit of bacon, a little bit of sausages, and as the war progressed, the sausages had less and less meat in them and more filler, which is why they're called bangers, actually, because they had so much filler that they used to bang when they were being cooked, and that's why the British called them bangers. Rationing went on all the way till 1954, because it just took the UK a long time before it was able to get back up to the normal amount of production and producing the normal kind of food, because the land was completely changed so that it was producing more crops, basically, because it was deemed that they produced more food per hectare, per acre than if you reared cows, for instance. So fish was very difficult to get hold of because all the coastline was heavily guarded. And there was a point system as well for tinned food. So I'm going to leave this there because I haven't got time today to go through the whole thing. So I'm going to stop the share and go back to where we are here. There we go. So basically the book, it kind of goes through all these different things. I'm going to read you just a little bit from the beginning. And it's set in a village in England, in southern England, in June 1942. And this is Mrs. Audrey Landon. A glorious spring morning poured its golden splendor through the tall kitchen window as a whirlwind of boys raced in, shooting at each other in a ramshackle reconstruction of Dunkirk. Get out of here, Audrey pushed them out with a dishcloth. The aroma of bubbling berries, raspberries, strawberries, red currants filled the big old kitchen as a slim woman of 40 added a touch of cinnamon, a touch of nutmeg. With a man's sweater tucked into a man's trousers, she looked hassled and unkempt, her old boots muddy from the vegetable garden. The wooden clock on the wall chimed the half hour, and she wiped the back of her hand on her forehead. Oh, nonsense, is it 8:30 already? She strode to the kitchen dresser to turn up the crackling wireless radio, which sat among a jumble of pots and a pile of freshly pulled carrots. While most people kept their radio sets in the living room, Audrey had hauled hers into the kitchen when she began furiously baking to make a few extra shillings. That had been just after the war began 2 years ago, when her husband Matthew's plane was shot down over Düsseldorf. No trace of him was ever found. In various moments, she tried to stop herself picturing his body, so intimate and dear to her, broken on treetops or burnt by an engine fire, his lifeblood spilled over the enemy's 7th largest city. Ever since his death, she had been run off her feet. Audrey had long given up trying to be a normal person. Every spare moment was giving over to baking, anything to make extra pennies. And she often worked long hours into the night, with 3 needy boys, debt demands coming weekly, and an old manor house falling apart around her. Normality had flown out of the dusty windows years ago. And that didn't even take into consideration the pig and the hens, the sizable garden now given over to fruits and vegetables, the precious extra ingredients that made her pies and cakes, exhaustion, disillusionment, and that panicky feeling that everything was running out of control had set up home in her heart. I'm going to leave it there. That's just that's the first, that's the very beginning of the book. So yes, that's all for me for now. Thank you very much again for listening.
Sorry, I don't know why I'm so slow to unmute myself today. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So we do have some time here at the end. This is good. We have almost 15 minutes for questions. I don't know if there's any other questions in the chat. I have one here from Joe Toplin. Questions for the panel. How do writers work with editors? What role do editors play? Who has the final say as to exactly what goes into the finished book? And I'll leave that to any of you that like to start with that one.
Well, editors are basically, I'll compare them to midwives. There are 2 kinds of editors, actually 3 kinds. There is the acquisitions editor who says, okay, I'll buy your book, and then gives suggestions which writers may or may not take, may resent, may accept. It's sort of a tightrope. It goes from there after compromises have been made or not made to a copy editor. Now, copy editors are supposed to find, and particularly for historical fiction, copy editors are supposed to find any errors or any inconsistencies. It's a very important job. William Faulkner is known for having said to a copy editor who said to him on page 71, I'm making up the pages, I don't remember, you have your character with brown eyes, and on page 117, let's say, he has blue eyes. Which do you want? And Faulkner said, I want both. That's how he was dealing with a copy editor who he felt, as all writers feel, are inconsistent. So editing is a tricky thing. There are happy relationships, there are fraught relationships, but writers, each writer, I think, confronts the situation in a very different way. I think my experience has been with many editors over the years. Some have been wonderful midwives trying to ease pain. Others have been not so wonderful, but writers have to get along with editors. It's one of the truths of the business.
Anyone else have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I think I think editors are there so that you don't. Editors are there to encourage you to produce your best work, and I think the best editors feel like they are just reminding you of something that you should have thought of already. But I think like the real, I mean, Gloria, you're absolutely right. Like the superstars are the ones who like read through for continuity errors. There's a lot of traveling in my book. And one of the readers had to go and figure out, I mean, I thought I had done it. And, you know, obviously I hadn't. He would say like, oh, well, here you say they traveled for 3 days. And so I count 2 sunsets. Do you like, is there a third one that is unmentioned, or do you want them only traveling 2 days? And I was like, man, like I didn't even think about that question. But editors are there to, I mean, they're there because, you know, they believe in the book. They believe in you as a writer. And I mean, my editor, who's fantastic, he has this great line, which is that his job is to read the book more intensely than any sane person would. And that's kind of the level of kind of insanity that we're trying to reach, is to have a perfectly cohesive object. And I think at a certain point, I think writers are wont to keep tinkering on something until it is almost about ready to fall apart. I think that's why we have deadlines. At a certain point, someone just comes in and says, "Hey, like, you're done with this. We're taking it out of your hands." Because even now, even when I do readings, sometimes I can't help myself. I'll like take out words. I'll like rephrase things. I'll string sentences together. I'm always shocked that I'm able to write anything at all. And when I do look at stuff that I allegedly have written, I feel that I can make it yet better. And the editor is there to really help that process along. And they're up because they believe in your book. You will have final say over what goes into the finished book. Up anything that's between the two covers. The cover is up to the publisher, but if you really, really believe in something, you make your case, you fight for it, and then if your editor's worth their salt, they'll say, "Yeah, I get it, and I see it, and let's leave it in."
That's great. And Jennifer, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but we also have a comment in the chat from Leslie. Really enjoyed the kitchen front. Looking forward to reading the others. I'll also ask just probably a lame question that you get all the time, as far as like historical fiction writers. Are any of the characters from the kitchen front based on real people?
That's a really great question. Thank you very much, Leslie, for your lovely comment there. No, they're not based. They are and they're not. As part of my research, my years and years of research that have gone into writing these books, I've interviewed a lot of people who were there at the time, and also I've read an awful lot of personal stories about the Second World War. And I think most of my characters are loosely based on someone that I would have read about, if that makes sense. It's some people that I know actually say, "Oh my goodness, did you base that character on someone that we know, or me, or something?" And it isn't like that. I think writing historical fiction is actually quite difficult to base it on someone who's alive today. I don't know if Gloria or Tom feel the same way, but people aren't the same, really. You wouldn't really be thinking in the same way that you did even 70 or 80 years ago. So yeah, I mean, the kitchen front, I read this wonderful story years ago about two women in the Second World War who met in a maternity hospital when they were giving birth, and they became really great friends. And after one of them, their houses was bombed out, then she moved in with her, with the friend that she'd met in the maternity home. And then a couple of other women moved in with their children. One of them stayed at home and looked after the kids, and the other ones were able to go out to work. And I think a story like that, you see, would be very much, it would very much influence me when it came to writing a story, because I just found it so touching. This alternative family set up with women, with mothers on their own, basically, all over the country, trying to struggle with childcare and work and everything. And it's stories like that, a lot of them that all go towards forming these characters.
All right, that makes sense to me. And Tom, with what you just brought up as your example from the editors, with the sort of vivid locales that you have in the book, do you travel extensively? Like, did you travel to all those areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I like, I think I'm trained as a critic, and so I do like the process of research and kind of collecting and assembling a collage of sources. But for me, it's always been really important to pass, how do I want to say this, to pass research through the body, because what you are providing in fiction is sensory experiences, and you're kind of recreating this world. And history, comes alive when you can kind of enter into this voluntary psychosis of being in a time that you are not in and experiencing experiences you've never experienced. And so it was important to me to get those things right, because I think so much of historical feeling is that, so much of historical fiction is that feeling of history being brought right up close to the reader and kind of sucking the reader in and repositioning them in time and space. And so I did travel. I drove back and forth along the 80. I also really like driving, writing a book, I think, is a very long-winded way to set yourself up to have some pretty cool experiences, especially if you call them research. And for me, that definitely was the case. But I would go to these places and, take pictures and take notes. And when I couldn't get to the places, I still tried to make kind of a sensory dialogue with the research. So for instance, there's a location in the book, Pyramid Lake, which is in northern Nevada. It's about 45 minutes out of Reno, 30 if you drive at the speed that everyone is going, which is far over the speed limit. And I couldn't make it out there while I was writing the book, but I wanted to know if I would drink the water at Pyramid Lake. It doesn't get a lot of rain and it's pretty cold, but I wanted to know if it was drinkable. So I looked up the salinity of it. And then using like a kitchen scale and kosher salt, I mocked up a glass of what I figured would be Pyramid Lake water, and I drank it, and it wasn't great, but I think it was drinkable, and so that did go in the book. And I think that kind of accuracy, it brings me great calm to dial in everything that exactly, and it also makes me feel like I have more liberty to introduce people with magic powers and prophecy.
We have another general question for the authors. What are you working on now? Anything that you can give us on that?
Well, I'm working on another work of biofiction. I seem to have fallen into that. I'm doing a novel based on the life of Chaim Soutine, which brings me into the world of painters, expressionist and impressionist painters in the revolutionary world of Paris during the early 20th and mid-20th century, and particularly the personality of Soutine, who is not as well known as many artists, but who has always fascinated me. So I'm nearing the end of that novel now. By that I mean I only have another year's work. So in any case, that's what I'm working on.
Jennifer, are you working on anything right now?
Yeah, I am. I'm working on my next book, which is called the Wedding Dress Sewing Circle. And it's because as I was writing The Kitchen Front, I got very much into rationing, and there was also clothes rationing going on at the same time. And I came across this wonderful story about a woman who was a vicar's wife, actually, and she shared her wedding dress, her own wedding dress, with anyone who wanted to borrow it, because it was impossible to get wedding dresses in the Second World War. It was actually illegal to make them. So it's basically a lot of information about how there's a contest, a kind of design contest, and a big fashion show as well that happens in the middle of it. And of course, there's a fashion designer as well, a very prominent fashion designer as well is one of the characters. And it's very, it's a wonderful book. There's a lot of more romance in it, I have to say, than in my normal books, which has been quite a breath of fresh air, actually. It's been a really wonderful, another really fascinating book to research and write. And that's coming out next year, so I'm very excited about that.
No, that's great. And Tom, I don't know if you're still doing the rounds for this book, but what's next for you, if you can tell us?
Yeah, the next project that I've begun, I've begun work on it doing research and pre-writing, is science fiction, near future, and it's going to be a heist story to steal a device that can grant its user subjective immortality.
Wow, okay.
That's what I got.
Okay, that's good. Well, actually, we're at 12:30 right now. Our authors have been so generous with their time. I want to thank you so much for doing this. I want to thank everyone that came here. I'm going to put another link. Giovanna was kind enough to do that in the chat, but I'll put another one for the Village Bookstore to buy their books. The next event is coming up as well. I'm going to put that in the link, so you could just click there to go right back to the event page. Again, Gloria, Jennifer, Tom, thank you so much for doing this. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Dan, for having us, and thank you, HPL, as well, for putting this whole event on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
very good to have been with you and to have met fellow authors. Jennifer, Tom, look forward to reading you.
Yes, that's
Get signed
absolutely
copies from the Village
brilliant.
Bookstore. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Giovanna, thank you very much for all your efforts and the typewriter. We loved
Oh, I
it.
love the little pen cup. Yes.
You're welcome. You're welcome. That was Jovi who found the typewriter.
Oh, marvelous.
It's fantastic.
None
My
of them-
colleague Jovi. Hope
I
glad to
think
hear
I'm
you.
using a cup, so it's much better now. It looks much cooler.
It'll remind you of the Harrison Public Library every time you look at that typewriter cup.
Fantastic. Thank you guys so much.